today we are in the third week of a 6-week sermon series. And we're talking about the 5 things that God uses to grow your faith. And the idea is that after hearing the stories of people talking about how their faith has grown, there's 5 things that consistently come up. So actually in your bulletins you'll see that there are some statements, but above that is the title of today's sermon, Providential Relationships. But you'll also see the 5 things kind of printed below it, a little bit smaller. So last week we talked about practical teaching, teaching that is helpful, teaching that you know what to do with it. It is the doing that makes a difference. Not in terms of your eternal salvation, that's God's doing. God has done what needs to be done. But in terms of God breaking into the practical realities of your life, it's the applying of those teachings. Today we're going to talk about the providential relationships. Next week we're going to talk about private disciplines. These are the things you do in private, like prayer, reading the scripture, tithing, the things that you kind of keep to yourself, but that will really grow you. After that, we're going to talk about personal ministry. These are the things that get you out of your comfort zone. These are like the mission trips or the teaching the kids, the various things that will stretch you. It's kind of that moment where you've gotten in over your head because you said yes to God and you're like, help me, I'm in over my head, right? I mean, when you get down to this sort of place, that's where you begin to grow. So we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. And then finally, we're going to talk about the pivotal life circumstances. Those moments in your life where, you're at a turning point. And depending on what you do with it, your life will either go in one direction or another. So these are like the loss of a loved one. Or they're like the loss of a job. Or sometimes even a promotion. It can be a good thing. It can be, the birth of a new child. But those pivotal life circumstances, God often leverages those to grow your faith. Now, today, providential relationships. These are the relationships that, looking back on them, it seems as if God put them in your life for a purpose. That God specifically put those people there to grow you for a season of your life. And a lot of times you don't even realize it's happening when you're in one, but it's the looking back on those relationships, on those teachers, those mentors. And so I'm going to ask you to do something. Some of you guys are going to like this. Some of you are going to hate this. In fact, if I was all you and there was a guy like me asking me to do this, what I'm about to ask you to do, I would be like, oh man, come on. Okay? But I'm still going to ask you to do it because this little exercise we're about to do has the ability to just bring this message right down to the ground of your life. And so I want to start there before I preach some more. So what I'd like you to do is think of somebody who has helped grow your faith. Somebody that God has put into your life providentially. It seems like God kind of put him there. Could be a family member, but it'd be even more powerful to think about some other folk as well. And if, I realize that some of you, this growing your faith sort of thing is maybe not where you're at. You got a lot of questions, and so that's okay. You might think about there's that person that has kind of piqued your curiosity about God and this faith sort of thing. Somebody that has just, influenced you a little bit that way, made you think about it a little bit. I want you to think of a person, and then I want you to turn to somebody. This is the part some of you will like and some of you won't. But just for a minute, and to say that person's name in just like a sentence or two about what they did. So go ahead and turn and share about this person that's made an impact on you. You might have to get up. When you finish, just go ahead and look up here in the front. See, what's neat about this is that when you start thinking about the people that have touched your lives, some of us can talk endlessly about these people, right? And you got more than one. Most of us, we can think of a lot of people. In fact, there's tons of people that I'd love to talk about today, this morning with you, but I'm just going to talk about 2 that would be providential relationships in my life. One of them was from back in high school, and one of them was from the church that I was at just prior to this. So back in high school, I grew up in the church. My dad, it was pretty much, we were going to go to church. There wasn't a whole lot of conversation about it. But, I wasn't really into the church thing. Quite frankly, I kind of thought Christianity was for old people, right? And I thought, hey, I would just kind of do my thing, and maybe when I got older and I didn't have a whole lot of options left, I would, become a Christian, And I figured that's a good time to do it because when you get older, sin's less attractive anyways, right? So I was kind of there. I was, going to church, but I wasn't really into church, especially this whole personal sort of relationship with God sort of thing. It was just not where I was. And then there was this man, Keith Worthington. And I didn't have a strong relationship with Keith one-on-one. But it was Keith and this other guy, John Zabo, that they put together a ministry in the church for the youth called the Appalachian Service Project. And I've talked about this a little bit already with you guys. But the Appalachian Service Project was a ministry that would take teenagers down to central Appalachia, so Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, places like that, into the mountain hollers. That's what they call them, mountain hollers. Like way back where cell phone service doesn't happen. You go on a windy road, then you get off that windy road, you get onto, a little tiny road, and then you get onto a gravel road, and I mean, you're way back there. It is that moment where, you get in over your head and you have this powerful experience because you're in somebody's home who lives in substandard housing. I mean, housing like many of us can't imagine. And you're there bonding with them, and you're repairing their home, and you're stretching yourself, both in terms of your construction skill, which most of us had none, and also in terms of your faith, like, can we really get this done? And so Keith Worthington and his predecessor, John Zabo, although I wasn't in a direct relationship with these guys, it was the fact that they had decided at some point in time that they were going to create this ministry in the church, these lay leaders. And they created this thing that benefited me and so many other youth. And it was like as if they were providentially in my life. God had placed those two guys at Geneva United Methodist Church to create this program that I could partake in as a teenager. I wrote my college essay about it. I came back and volunteered as a college kid, and then when I became a youth pastor at Northminster Presbyterian Church on the north side of Chicago, many years later, the first thing I did was sign us up for ASB. So when the second guy that I want to tell you about is in this context of Northminster Presbyterian Church. His name is Al Williams, my brother Al. And when I started at this church, I didn't know anybody, which is just kind of how it is when you start at a church, right? And one of the programs that they had in place was called Challenge Class. It was on Sunday mornings. It was a youth program at 11 o'clock, and some of the kids showed up. It's basically kind of like a Bible study. And I think pretty much on my first day, Al walks in. And he showed up. Nobody asked him to be there. But he just came, and the next week Al was there, and I didn't ask him to be there. And the week after that, guess who was there? Al. And for like the next 9 years, Al was just there. Nobody had asked him to be there. I mean, I eventually kind of welcomed him being there. I saw the value of him, but he just decided he was going to make it his thing. Because Al had 3 daughters. And when he started off, the first daughter was in 8th grade. She was about to be a high school kid. So he just said, I'm going to, in this season of my life, I'm going to invest in these kids. And then Al started to invest in me. He would let me lead, and he would support me, and he would encourage me. And this is a guy who was the head of the editing department for Harpo. Do you all know what Harpo is? It's Oprah spelled backwards. That's Oprah's company. So this is a big league sort of guy. I mean, this guy's a leader, but he just chose that he was going to invest in our youth program, and he was going to invest in me. And he just stood behind me and encouraged me and let me lead. And it was so, so powerful. And together, Al and I, we really developed this Appalachian Service Project, him and a couple other key people. And he was my wingman. I mean, he would tell you that. Here's this guy that's older than me, more accomplished than me, but just investing in me. So towards the end of the sector, consider leaving ministry altogether. Because the needs of our family at that point in time were such that It just made the most sense. So a couple years ago, despite all the time and energy that Hannah and I had invested in my vocation as a pastor, we were ready to walk away because it just seemed like that's what we had to do. And so through this church, I knew a lot of people by that point in time. So I started meeting with folks, because a lot of them were professionals, and I thought they could help me and that sort of thing. And so I met with them one by one, and they, grieved the fact that I would be leaving ministry and affirmed the things that I had done, but were willing to kind of help me out. And they encouraged me in the transition until I met with Al, my wingman, the person you would think that would be encouraging me more than anybody else. And when I told Al what I was planning to do, I could tell he was upset. And he told me he was. And he said he was disappointed. He said all these years he had invested in me and stood behind me, and for me to leave at this point, he couldn't believe it. That was awkward, right? I mean, it was like, this is the guy I thought that was going to, stand behind me more than anybody else, and here he is, and it's awkward. It's like, can we end this lunch any faster? And quite frankly, I was a little angry. Kind of think it's none of your damn business, Al. Right? And here he is. I'm like down, hurting, and I feel like he's kicking me while I'm down, and it's hurtful. But you know what? When I look back at that conversation, Al was risking relationship with me, risking being awkward with me to tell me the truth that was on his heart, and I needed to hear it. Because my heart opened back up to the possibility of finding some way to stay in ministry. And so here I am, partly because Al was put there providentially by God for a season of my life, and then at a pivotal circumstance, he was willing to be awkward. He was willing to risk the relationship to tell me the truth I needed to hear. Really, really powerful providential relationships often will do this sort of kind of dirty, hard work of loving each other. So God used Al Williams, God used Keith Worthington, God used John Zabel, God used all these people in my life to get me here today, to have the faith that I have today. And he's continuing to use people as well. So the first statement in your bulletin, if you want to follow along with that, is simply this. God uses human relationships to grow our relationship with him. The takeaway for today's sermon is real simple. You already know it, just kind of observing, in your own life and people around you, that God uses human relationships to grow our relationship with him. And this is not a new principle. In fact, several weeks ago, I preached on this text. This is part of the text from 2 Corinthians. Paul says God is making his appeal through us. So God is using human relationships to grow our relationship with him. Real simple. Okay? So the scripture for today is both from Proverbs and then another one from one of Paul's letters. And the only reason I'm going to show you these scriptures is that they kind of reiterate something you already know, which is God uses human relationships to grow our relationship with God. The first one is walk with the wise and become wise. We'll stop there for a second. Walk with the wise and become wise. And you know this, right? I mean, when you hang out with people that are more disciplined, with people that are more patient, with people who are planners, it helps you become more disciplined, helps you become more patient, helps you become more of a planner. Because God will use the wise to help you become wise. And a wise person is simply this. A wise person understands that there's a connection between what you do today and what happens with you tomorrow. They understand that life is connected, and then they act accordingly. That's why wise people are planners. That's why wise people have patience. That's why wise people are thoughtful. Because they understand the connection between one thing and the next. They understand that going to bed early helps you feel good when you get up early, right? I mean, this is not anything new for you. It's just a principle, and you already know. Now, walk with the wise and become wise, for the companion of fools, you all are thinking what I was thinking, becomes what? A fool, right? But that's not what Solomon tells us. Actually, he says, Walk with the wise and become wise, for the companion of fools suffers harm. You don't need to be a fool yourself to be harmed by a fool. Right? And a fool, I talked about it last week, it's simply the opposite of being wise. It's the person that understands there's a connection between one thing and another, and then they behave as if that connection does not exist. They get that going to bed at a certain time will help you feel good at a certain time in the next morning, but then they stay up all night. I'm often a fool. I like to watch Netflix late, right? So the companion of fools suffers harm. Now, I got kind of an extreme example, but it makes the example about this principle. When I was in college, I was in a fraternity and did a lot of foolish things, but I had one friend who was a fool in a particular sort of way. He would drink too much, and then he would run his mouth and get into fights. Anybody ever know anybody like that? Right? This is my buddy, a good guy in most circumstances, but we would go out, he'd have a little too much fun, and then it was like he was a magnet for conflict. And he always thought it was the other person, but we kind of figured out, hey, you're the common denominator in all these things. So one night, I actually had stayed in, luckily, but my whole group of friends went out. And there this friend of mine was, doing his thing, running his mouth, drinking too much, and all of a sudden a fight breaks out between him, another guy, and then my whole group of friends and their whole group of friends. Like a 7-on-7, like bar brawl happens. Can you imagine? Right? These are all my close friends. Several of them get arrested. One kid eventually gets put in the hospital. And it's because our friend who was acting foolishly caused harm to the rest of us. And you know that about relationships. There's certain relationships, just by being in those, they can cause you harm. Right? Paul says basically the same thing. Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Bad company corrupts good character. Now, my best friend in high school, his name's Chris. And he ended up being my best man. But in high school, he was the only friend that my parents asked me not to hang out with anymore. You ever have to do that with a friend? Because Chris was bad company. And I got in my worst trouble when I was with him. What my parents didn't realize is that I was also bad company for Chris. His parents, if they knew better, they should have asked that he not hang out with me. We were like a magnet for trouble together. We had a lot of fun, but it was reckless. And in that season of my life, even though I rejected the fact that my parents would ask me not to hang out with my best friend, they were right. In that season, we were not good company for each other. But later on, we went off to college and did all that. I went off to grad school, and then we kind of ended back up in Chicago at the same time, became roommates. We'd both grown up. My wife would probably tell you that we were still bad company for each other a little bit, but we were much, much wiser at that point in time. And so that's kind of one of the principles here. I'm talking on a topic that's kind of hard, which is there's certain people in our lives that will cause us harm. Just like there's certain people in our lives that can help us grow. And so you might be asking, does that mean that we're just, not supposed to love them or we're not supposed to stay connected? That's not what I'm saying. But during a season of your life, there's certain people that you might need to have appropriate boundaries around. During high school, my parents were right. I should not have been socializing with Chris as much as I was, because I was bad company for him, he was bad company for me. Later, we had grown up. We were okay together. So it leads to this statement. Isn't it true that some of your greatest regrets can be traced back to certain relationships? When you think about the greatest regrets in your life, there's certain relationships that they're connected to. Now, I know you can get in trouble on your own, but rarely do you do so. It's normally with bad company, with other people that maybe it's just a bad relationship for you. You're part of the problem, they're part of the problem. But our relationships can help us grow strong, and our relationships can also weaken us. Relationships that will build you up, and then you can choose or just kind of go along with it and end up in relationships that will tear you down. Or maybe it's at the office, and there's a relationship that you can't exactly break because they're your boss or they're your, office mate or something like that. Or maybe it's a family member and you can't exactly disinvite them to Christmas. But there's certain relationships that maybe you need to put a boundary around in terms of like letting them speak into your life. Maybe when they give you their opinion of you, you just need to have a firm wall up and say, yeah, I'm not letting that in. Right? So who you choose to spend time with, who you choose to have access to you, has the potential to influence your confidence in God. It might grow it, and it might diminish it. So this relationship thing is key. Which is why at Faith UCC, why here, we want to move people from rows into circles. Okay? This might be a bit of a jump for you, but this is something that I've been talking with our leadership group about. They kind of came up with some of this, the idea of the circles or the small groups in their own little breakout sessions. We're talking more about it, how to exactly do it, but the point is we want to move from rows, which is what you all are in, into circles. Now, I still want you to come and sit in rows because it would be kind of weird to preach to an empty sanctuary, but the point is, the target is to move you from these rows and into circles. Why? Because it's in those circles where life really happens. It's in those circles where you develop intimacy, you develop relationships, where you can grow each other's faith and you can support each other's faith when life gets really hard. And we can do a little bit of that here, but it's in those circles when you're meeting face to face, intentionally investing in one another, that those relationships become so powerful that they can help you in a time of need. Two quick stories about some famous pastors. One is about Rick Warren. Some of you might know him. He wrote the book, The Purpose-Driven Life. It's a very famous book. And I was just getting into listening to some of Rick's sermons, and it just so happened the first sermon I ever heard by him was his first sermon he preached after being on a sabbatical, a year off. And the reason he took a year off from ministry is the unfortunate circumstance of his adult son committing suicide. So I'm out there mowing the lawn. I listen to a lot of sermons while I'm mowing the lawn. I'm out there mowing the lawn. I'm hearing this sermon for the first time, and there's this power to it, right? And I don't really know what it's about, but I finally start to put two and two together, and it's his first sermon that he preached after being gone for a year after his son had committed suicide. And he said during his sermon, he said, we would not have survived, him and his wife Kay, we would have not survived this year if it wasn't for that small group that we've been with for 11 years. They showed up, they stayed the night at my house, they supported Kay and I through the most difficult time of our lives. Rick Warren, big church, big pastor, famous guy, man of faith, and it was his small group that he said really carried him through. Story number 2 is about Bill Hybels. He's a pastor of Willow Creek Church in Chicago. And he writes about this in a book that I read. And he says that one day after church, this young couple comes up to him, and they're holding a baby. And the baby's kind of covered up, and they say, Bill, will you pray for our baby? He says, of course I'll pray for your baby. So he takes the baby, and he pulls back the blanket, and the baby has severe deformities, and it's clear that this young child only has a few months to live. Bill talks about how he's speechless just at the sight of this child, and how, he doesn't really know what to say, and he says he stumbles over his words and says, of course I'll pray, but what can we do for you to support you? How can the church be here for you? And they say, Pastor Bill, truly, we're okay. About a year and a half ago, we got into a small group finally, and that group has been showing up and supporting us all the way through this. All we need is your prayer. We are good. You created the structure in this church for us to be in that group. That's what we needed. When my father passed away, my own small group that I've been in for a year showed up without us asking. I mean, we were up to our ears in lasagna. I mean, that's what church people do, right? They show up with a casserole or something, and they were just there because we were already connected. So moving people from rows into circles, as long as you want me to be your pastor here, that is going to be a primary focus because it's in those circles, when we start doing life together in an intimate sort of way, that we really gain the power of the church. Now, what I'm going to say next, I'm hoping is going to upset a few of you. Because we're not ready to get you in a circle just yet. And I'm hoping a few of you are saying, "Oh, great, sign me up." Okay? But we need to put in the organizational kind of infrastructure to be able to get you into circles in a way that is done well. Because this is so important, we don't want to just kind of take a stab at it and then have it fail because we didn't think it through enough. All right? But I want to show you this. Okay? These are the steps that we're taking so far, and they might look a little bit familiar. When I first started here, I focused on just simply greeting one another, which is why I had you all repeat. What is your name again? Right? Because it's by knowing each other's names that we start to get into a relationship with each other. Then, it might look familiar, these coffee hour conversations. It is by having these brief conversations with each other, it's a little bit more intimate, a little bit more risky than just saying hello. But it starts to build the connections. And I know a lot of you are already connected, but we want to be intentional about making these connections. And finally, the next thing that I haven't told you until this moment, what I would love to see is for us to begin to be a little church community that goes out to lunch. Wouldn't it be great if almost everybody here today had a lunch date with somebody else afterwards? And I get it, lunches are risky because, you might sit down with that person for like an hour and you might not even like them. That could happen. It's okay. You don't have to like everybody. I'm not meant for everybody, you're not meant for everybody. But you go to lunch with each other. You have that hour, you got to negotiate who's going to pay, where you're going to go, and it's just building relationships. And what our leadership team is going to do is we're going to figure out the steps in between to get us into a position to have a strong, small group ministry as one of the key components of what we do here. We come in, worship in rows, and then we meet in intimate groups. So to kind of sum it up, our part is to be intentional about putting ourselves in environments where providential relationships can happen. Right? Intentional. That's the difference maker. That we're trying to do this. We're purposeful about doing this. It's not just about being nice to one another. It's about getting in relationship with one another because God will use our relationships here providentially to grow our faith. So I want to conclude with this. You got two choices that you got to think about. First one is, will you allow God to use others to grow you? God is teeing up relationships in your life that are there, that are around you. It might be people that you're not expecting. It might be people you've known for a long time. But God's going to use them for a season of your life to help grow your faith. And so will you allow God to use these people to grow you? Will you lean into those relationships? Because those relationships can come and go and you can miss the opportunity. Will you lean into them? Will you say, "Hey, can we have lunch? Can we have coffee?" Or when you're asked, say, "Yes, I'll go." The second one is, will you allow God to use you to grow others? Just like God is teeing up relationships to help grow you, God is looking to use you providentially in the life of somebody else. Maybe in a small group, maybe just going out to lunch, maybe teaching our children, right? Maybe, the varieties of the ways, maybe being on our leadership team. Will you allow God to use you to grow others? Will you lean into this idea? Because God uses human relationships to grow our relationship with Him. Our final hymn is Standing in the Need of Prayer.